Hello. Tonight, you will be listening to John Lewis Esposito talking about Islam in the West from the Great World Religion series.
Although estimates of the number of American Muslims vary from 4 to 12 million, there are at least 6 million, making Islam the third largest religion after Christianity and Judaism in America. And in Europe, the approximately 15 million Muslims make Islam the second largest religion. Many believe that in the first half of the 21st century, Islam will become the second largest religion in America. So Islam is very much in the West. Historically, Muslims were present in America before the 19th century. The explorers, traders, and settlers who visited the New World from the time of Columbus included Moriscos, Spanish Muslims who hid their Muslim faith. They migrated to both Spanish and Portuguese settlements in America. Between 14 and 20% of the African slaves brought to America between the 16th and the 19th centuries were Muslim, although they were forced to convert to Christianity. Indians and Arabs who were not slaves also immigrated during this period and maintained their spiritual, cultural, and social identity. The numbers of Muslims in America increased in the late 19th century. Significant numbers of immigrants from the Arab world, places like Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, settled in the Midwest and Canada as blue-collar workers and assimilated into American society. After World War II, large numbers of immigrants from Palestine who had lost their homes after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, as well as elites from the Middle East and South Asia and other places, seeking higher education or professional advancement came to America. In recent decades, many students from the Muslim world have come to study, and many well-educated professionals and intellectuals have emigrated from South and Southeast Asia, as well as from the Middle East and parts of Africa, for political and economic reasons. About 2/3 of the Muslims in America today are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. The other third is indigenous, made up of African Americans, many African American converts to Islam, along with smaller numbers, but a significant number of white American converts, and more recently, Hispanic Muslims. The largest Muslim communities in the United States are in cities like Boston, New York, Detroit, Dearborn, Toledo, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles. As compared to 30 years ago when I first began to study Islam, and Islam was invisible on our landscape, in many of not only these major cities, but many rural areas, you will find today mosques and Islamic centers. Like most Americans, Muslims in America are diverse. We sometimes forget this. We'll say, are there 6 or 8 million Muslims? And the presumption will be that they are all religiously observant, for example. Whereas we don't make that same presumption when we talk about the numbers of Jews or Christians. So Muslims in America are diverse. They're secular and religious, observant and non-observant, liberal, conservative, fundamentalist, Democrat, and Republican. African American Islam emerged in the early 20th century when a number of black Americans converted to Islam. The religion they believed was part of their original African identity, preferred over Christianity, which was seen as a religion of white supremacy and oppression, the slaveholders' religion, as it were. In the early 1930s, Wallace D. Fard Muhammad, called the Great Mahdi, drew on the Quran and the Bible, to preach black liberation and build the Nation of Islam in the ghettos of Detroit. When he mysteriously disappeared in 1934, Elijah Muhammad, who lived from 1897 to 1975, took over and built what was called the Nation of Islam into an effective national movement whose members became known as Black Muslims. Elijah Muhammad denounced white society's political and economic oppression of blacks and its results: self-hatred, poverty, and dependency, and taught self-improvement and empowerment. By the 1970s, his Nation of Islam had more than 100,000 members. Many black Muslim movement beliefs at that time differed from mainstream Islam. And the nation, for example, did not follow the 5 pillars of Islam or observe major Muslim rituals. A number of basic beliefs in the black Muslim movement differed significantly from mainstream Islam. Black separatism. Remember the notion of the Ummah. The community of Muslims transcends race, tribe, nation. Elijah Muhammad announced that Wallace D. Fard was Allah, which would go directly against mainstream Islamic thought. And thus that God was a black man, and that he, Elijah Muhammad, not the Prophet Muhammad, was the last messenger of God. The nation taught black supremacy and black separatism, not Islam's brotherhood. That brotherhood that transcends, as I said earlier, racial, tribal, and ethnic differences. A prominent figure that emerged, an almost charismatic leader, was Malcolm X. He took the X meaning ex-smoker, ex-drinker, ex-Christian, and ex-slave. Malcolm gained prominence in the Nation of Islam. However, in 1964, he started his own organization and went on pilgrimage to Mecca, returning as El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, a mainstream Muslim. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated as he spoke to an audience in New York City. 2 members of the Nation of Islam were convicted of the murder. In the 1960s, the sons of Elijah Muhammad challenged their father's teachings and strategies. Near the end of his life, Elijah Muhammad also himself made the pilgrimage to Mecca and began to modify some of his teachings. One of his sons, Wallace D. Muhammad, succeeded the father as supreme minister of the Nation of Islam and implemented major reforms. He revised doctrines and organizational structure so that they conformed to the teachings of orthodox, or again, mainstream Sunni Islam. Wallace Fard was thus identified now as the founder of the nation, and Elijah Muhammad as the leader who brought black Americans to his interpretation of Islam. Wallace Muhammad made the pilgrimage to Mecca and encouraged his followers to study Arabic in order to better understand Islam. Temples, and the Nation of Islam had called its places of meeting or worship temples, were renamed mosques, and their leaders were now called imams, leaders. Not the imam in the sense of the imam in Shia Islam, but the generic term imam, which just means leader, which is used in Islam for a leader, a religious leader, particularly one who leads the prayer, and often the person who, for example, runs or supervises the mosque. But anyone who leads the prayer can be called the imam, the leader of the prayer. So now they came to be called imams rather than ministers. The community observed the 5 pillars of Islam in union with the worldwide Islamic community to which they now belong. Black separatist doctrines were dropped as the nation community began to participate within the American political process. Finally, the equality of male and female members was reaffirmed, and women were given more responsible positions in the ministry of the community. While the nation continued to work for social and economic change, business ventures were cut back and religious identity and mission were given greater priority. At the end of the 1970s, Wallace transferred organizational leadership to an elected council of 6 imams, or leaders, and focused on his own role as primarily a religious and spiritual leader. In the mid-1980s, signaling his and the nation's new religious identity and mission, Wallace changed his name to Warith Deen Muhammad and renamed the community the American Muslim Mission, integrating it within the global mainstream Islamic community and within the American Muslim community. Remembering that community is made up of both immigrant and indigenous. Media coverage of the black Muslim movement often focuses on Louis Farrakhan, who led a minority of nation members in protest against Warith's reforms. In recent years, Farrakhan, who then became the leader of and retained the notion of the Nation of Islam, with many of the trappings leaders called ministers, etc. Farrakhan himself moved away from some of his earlier black separatist doctrines, or claimed to move away, and his anti-Semitic statements, and has moved the nation closer to more orthodox Islamic practices, maintaining a desire for a closer identity with mainstream Islam. The problems the growing Muslim community faces in America start with the fact that only a few decades ago, Muslims were mostly invisible in the West. Their visibility then emerged by association often with the militant nation of Islam, or conflicts such as the Iranian Revolution, hijackings and hostage-taking in the Middle East and South Asia. Some saw these events as signs of an Islamic threat or a clash of civilization, Islam versus the West. America's relationship with Muslims was seen within a context of conflict and confrontation. Islam was viewed as a foreign religion, distinct from the Judeo-Christian tradition, rather than the notion of children of Abraham. This reinforced a sense of us and them. Subsequent attacks against America and Americans in Somalia, Saudi Arabia, Africa in the late 1990s, and most recently in New York and Washington on 9/11, have led many to regard Islam and Muslims with fear and distrust. They judge Islam as inherently violent and militant, religiously and culturally. This has an impact on the status and role of Muslims. Like many other immigrants of diverse religious and ethnic backgrounds, Muslims have been challenged to define their place in America and European society. Like Jews and Catholics before them, they struggle with assimilation, integration, multiculturalism, intermarriage, gender relations, worship and education, a whole host of issues. Some struggle with the English language, as new immigrants do, as well as holding on to their native or homeland cultures. How much of the old culture should one hold on to? And many face religious and ethnic discrimination in the workplace and in society. Like Jewish law for Jews, as I noted earlier, Islamic law is central to a Muslim's life, covering religious requirements, dietary regulations, and family law. And so for Muslims living as minorities in America and Europe, the question is, how does one then bring this along, fit it into the new environment, into the new culture, into the new society? Ironically, many of the non-Muslim minorities who preceded them and made it in America do not identify with Muslims and fail to see the similarities between their own past and Muslims' current problems. It was disheartening to me at one point to see, after 9/11, the owner of a gas station, who from his name looked like he was Italian-American, saying, send them all back to where they came from. And I kept thinking, being Italian-American, this guy probably is second generation. And suddenly he acts as if he was always here, as if he were a Native American Indian or came over on the Mayflower. And has suddenly fallen into an us and them mentality. Oftentimes, Muslims fall outside the circle, therefore, of American pluralism. That is, the comfortable circle. Because they are not part of the Judeo-Christian or even, in a sense, secular culture, that perception. However different previous religious and ethnic minorities, the vast majority were Judeo-Christian. Most regard Islam or have regarded Islam as foreign. Few have thought of it as an Abrahamic religion, as part of a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. In the absence of this knowledge and awareness, Islam is often seen through explosive headline events. And thus, as I've said before, the hatred and violence of a minority of religious extremists obscure the faith of the mainstream majority. In recent years, a major issue for Muslims has been the Americanization of the Muslim experience. Because imams coming from foreign countries are not always aware of or sensitive to the problems that American Muslims encounter, the training of native imams or indigenous imams has been seriously undertaken since the 1980s. Legal councils addressing life in America and the issues of life in America have been founded to respond to questions raised by communities here in America, rather than always relying on scholars overseas to provide the norm or interpret the norm for today, although that continues to exist as well. Muslims do participate today increasingly in interfaith activities with Jews and Christians, both at the national level, the international level, but also at the local level. A host of national and international organizations have been created to monitor and promote Muslim causes and Muslim interests, much as other ethnic and religious groups have done the same before them. Despite problems, however, Muslims long regarded as other are now part of the fabric of our society, as neighbors, as co-workers, as citizens, as co-believers. I often give the example of, at one point, my wife had an accident. We needed to rush her to the hospital at Georgetown. Fortunately, it proved not to be super serious. But the first physicians that we encountered at Georgetown Hospital were a Saudi resident, an Iranian American. So the first two physicians were from the Muslim world, indicating the beginning of that change. Muslims have increasingly become more integrated into the American political process, both as individuals and organizationally. Now, the situation in Western Europe is somewhat the same, somewhat different. Estimates of the number of Muslims living in Western Europe range from 12 to 15 million, but I'll work with the 15 million figure. The ethnic diversity of Muslims in Europe represents most of the major ethnic groups of the Muslim world. Remember, a key factor here, too, is that Europe was a major colonial power, and so many people from the colonies then came to European countries after independence and since the time of independence. Most numerous are Turks, Algerians, Moroccans, Pakistanis. Because of this great diversity, despite a common religious bond, it is difficult to speak of a homogeneous Muslim community in any individual country, let alone across Europe. Muslims may be found in significant numbers in most Western European countries. The largest Muslim populations are in France, approximately 5 million, Germany, approximately 3.2 million, and the United Kingdom, 2 million. Followed by smaller communities in such countries as Belgium, Spain, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Austria. Some estimates indicate that Muslims will outnumber non-Muslims in Europe by the year 2050. This is a contentious point, but it's out there. In many of the major European cities, however, given the low birth rates of an indigenous non-Muslim populations, Muslim school children will be in the majority within the next decade. Now, the major waves of Muslim migration to Europe came after World War II, due in large part to labor immigration and a vestigial colonial connection. When their countries achieved independence, some, many, depending on what country and the conditions there, Muslims chose to emigrate. Professionals and skilled laborers from former European colonies in Africa, South Asia, and the Arab world sought a better life. But a significant difference between the European and the American experience can be seen in the 60s and 70s, and it affects the extent to which the majority of Muslims in Europe, in fact, come from an unskilled laborer background rather than the professional side. In the 1960s and 70s, unskilled laborers flooded into a Europe whose growing economies were in need of cheap labor and welcomed cheap labor. From the 1970s onward, increasing numbers of Muslim students came to Europe, as they did to America, to study as well. While many returned home, others for political and very much for economic reasons chose to stay. France has the largest Muslim population in Europe. It's 5 million Muslims, including more than 35,000 converts, accounts for almost 10% of the population. Most Muslims in France come from North Africa. Britain's 2 million Muslims come primarily from the Indian subcontinent, but increasingly from other parts of the world. from the Middle East, from North Africa. In contrast to Germany, where citizenship and the right to vote are more difficult to obtain, most Muslims in Britain, for example, come from British Commonwealth countries, and thus were able to enjoy British citizenship and full participation in political life, as voters and as candidates. Indeed, some have been elected to political office and are members of the House of Lords and Parliament. Now, the issue of assimilation has been particularly acute in France, where after a long battle, the government has taken a firm stand on full integration rather than the multicultural approaches of Britain and America. So integration rather than multicultural approach. In a celebrated case, France outlawed the wearing of a headscarf or hijab by female students. Both France's Ministry of Education and its teachers' unions were united in claiming that the hijab violated France's secular constitution and traditions. They made no such argument with regard to Jewish students wearing a yarmulke or Christians wearing Christian chains or pendants. After several years of bitter debate, the French Constitutional Council ruled in October 1996 that despite the Education Ministry's ban, students could not be expelled, for indeed they had been, students could not be expelled for wearing headscarves if no proselytizing occurred. At the heart of the French debate has been a tendency to see Islam as a foreign religion, placing it over and against its Judeo-Christian and very strong secular tradition, that is France's secular tradition. While the government has insisted upon a process of acculturation that left little room for a multicultural approach, many Muslims have argued that they should be allowed to develop a distinct French Muslim identity that blends established French principles and values with their Islamic faith and values. However different their experiences may be, Muslims in Europe and America have common concerns about practicing their faith, retaining Islamic identity, and preserving family life and values. Specific concerns include taking time out from work to pray daily, to attend mosque on Friday, to celebrate religious feasts, particularly the great Eids or festivals, the Eid al-Adha and the Eid al-Fitr. The availability of halal food, that is food that is carefully prepared or correctly slaughtered, analogous to kosher food within Judaism. The ability of that halal food or foods in schools or in the military or prisons. Now this increasingly is being addressed and has been addressed. And for those women who wish the right to wear a headscarf or hijab. Also the issue of a beard has come up with regard to some police forces and in other kinds of positions in these societies. Some request segregated athletics classes, are concerned about co-education, sex education, and secularism in the school. And in some of these issues, they're not very different from those of conservative Christians and Jews, or many conservative Christians and Jews. I use the term conservative here in the broader sense. Others have supported the development of Islamic schools as a way to address these issues, as, for example, Catholics and Jews in the past did, to develop religious schools, so Islamic schools. Or, like a growing number of non-Muslim Americans, have turned to homeschooling, teaching their children at home. Living as a minority in a dominant culture that is often ignorant about Islam, or even hostile to it, many Muslims experience at times a sense of marginalization, alienation, and powerlessness. That's not to say that for many, there isn't a sense of fitting in, of being able to move forward, of being accepted. But for a minority, these problems exist. Some Muslims are further marked as different by their manner of dress. As I said before, particularly women who wear a veil, men who wear beards or skull caps or turbans, and they are sometimes singled out for harassment. In fact, think of the Sikh cab driver, a non-Muslim, who was murdered post 9/11, because whoever did it apparently thought that somehow he was a Muslim, because he saw a turban. This has increasingly been the case since September 11, 2001. Muslim experiences in Europe and America have been affected significantly by the actions of these militants. as well as by domestic issues. Thus, for example, in France, amidst growing unemployment, Jean-Marie Le Pen's right-wing National Front targeted Muslims, who had been welcomed during a period of economic expansion as a cheap foreign labor force. They became a convenient scapegoat, charged with stealing French jobs. Le Pen advocated the forced expulsion of 3 million immigrants, as well as priority for native French in jobs, housing, and welfare benefits. At the same time, many North Africans from Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria have entered France legally and illegally. The civil war in Algeria that we've talked about before caused many more Algerians to flee to France, swelling the ranks of its sizable North African population. After the Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria swept, remember, the first Algerian municipal elections and the parliamentary elections in the early 1990s, the military had stepped in, seized power, canceled the second round of parliamentary elections, denied the feast their parliamentary victory, charging that Islamists were out to use elections to hijack democracy. In the ensuing spiral of violence and counter-violence, which claimed more than 100,000 lives, moderates became radicalized. Not all, but some. And new extremist groups like the Armed Islamic Group rose up, as well as extremist groups within the military, called the Eradicateurs. Bombings in Paris attributed to Algeria's radical armed Islamic group and post-9/11 concern about Al-Qaeda and the arrests of suspected terrorists have contributed to questions about Islam's compatibility with French culture, its Judeo-Christian or secular life, world, and whether Muslims could be true and loyal citizens of France. In America, the World Trade Center bombing of 1993 and the subsequent conviction of Sheikh Umar Abdurrahman and others for plotting other attacks in major urban areas like New York had raised serious questions about domestic terrorism. The attacks of 9/11, revelations about the presence of many of the attackers in America, the fact that they lived in America, but also visited and lived in Europe, and the use of legislation like the Secret Evidence and Patriot Acts, and its continued use, and new measures being proposed for the Congress, and actions being proposed and taken by the FBI and other agencies, such as raising issues about the monitoring not of some mosques but all mosques, or the question of whether all Muslims should be monitored, the issue of profiling, indiscriminate profiling, have raised substantial questions, both within the Muslim community, but also among non-Muslims, about the future of civil liberties for Muslim Americans. Similar questions have been raised within Europe. So as we look at the Muslim experience in the West, in America and Europe, we can make some observations. Despite problems, Muslims, long regarded as other, are seen increasingly as now part of the fabric of American and European societies by many in our society. In America, they are more and more regarded by most as neighbors, co-workers, citizens, and believers. But we still have major problems. Some of the emails and letters that I get from some people, some of them claiming to be Christians or belonging to Christian groups, or the statements made by people like Pat Robertson and Franklin Graham, statements that Islam is an evil religion, the failure to distinguish between Muslims, extremists, and mainstream Islam. Those create enormous problems for Muslims, and I think enormous problems within our own non-Muslim society. Muslims have increasingly, though, become more integrated into the American political process, both as individuals and organizations. A host of national and international organizations have been created to monitor and promote Muslim causes and interests. Among the more prominent are the American Muslim Council, the AMC, the Council for American Islamic Relations, CARE, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC, and the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, CSID. We at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown ran a major project called Muslims in the American Public Square, studying these issues in this role. However, issues of coexistence continue. First and foremost, the need to distinguish between the faith and practice of the majority of Muslims and the actions of a minority of religious extremists. Muslims and non-Muslims in the West face a common challenge of pluralism and tolerance. Too often in the past, tolerance has meant suffering the existence of others while regarding them as inferior. Today, all are challenged to embrace a modern form of pluralism and tolerance based upon mutual understanding and respect. To affirm the truth of one's own religion or worldview does not exclude the ability to acknowledge principles and values shared by others. Recognition of significant religious differences can still be accompanied by respect for the rights of others to hold different religious beliefs.